The automatic camera clicked steadily as Major Robert Cowboy Stout's F6F Hellcat swept over Peleliu at 8,000 feet. It was September 12, 1944. His orders were simple: photograph the northern airfield and return to USS Hornet. Intelligence had assured him the field was abandoned, probably damaged by previous bombing raids. Then Stout looked down, and his blood went cold. The airfield below was packed with Japanese aircraft. Mitsubishi Zeros, Nakajima bombers, dozens of them lined up wingtip to wingtip. Fuel drums were stacked in neat rows, and ground crews swarmed around each plane. They weren't abandoned. They were preparing for a massive strike. Stout counted quickly, at least 40 aircraft, fully armed and fueled. And he knew exactly what they were waiting for. In 3 days, 28,000 Marines would storm the beaches of Peleliu in one of the largest amphibious assaults of the Pacific War. The invasion fleet was already steaming toward the island. These 40 Japanese aircraft were positioned to massacre them before they reached shore. Stout's training was clear: spot enemy forces, radio the coordinates, return to base, and let command decide how to respond. A reconnaissance pilot's job was to observe and report, not engage. Especially not alone against an entire airfield bristling with anti-aircraft guns. But Stout also understood military bureaucracy. By the time he landed, filed his report, and command assembled a strike package, hours would pass. Maybe a whole day. The Japanese would scatter the aircraft, hide them in revetments, or worse, launch them against the fleet. The Marines landing in 3 days didn't have time for procedure. They needed these planes destroyed now, not tomorrow. Stout circled higher, studying the layout below. The Japanese had made a critical mistake in their haste. The aircraft were packed too close together, surrounded by exposed fuel drums. One good hit could start a chain reaction that would consume the entire field. He checked his ammunition. 650 caliber Browning machine guns. 2,400 rounds total, roughly 12 seconds of sustained fire. Not enough to destroy 40 aircraft one by one, but enough to light a very big fuse. Robert Stout wasn't a reckless pilot. At 28 years old, he had flown 63 combat missions. He'd survived dogfights with Zeros, attacked fortified positions, and landed on carriers in storms that kept other pilots grounded. He understood the difference between courage and suicide. What he was considering now walked that line. If he attacked, every anti-aircraft gun on Peleliu would target him. He would be alone, with no wingmen to suppress fire or cover his escape. One lucky shot to the engine or cockpit could send him into the jungle with no hope of rescue. If he didn't attack, those 40 aircraft would launch in waves against the invasion fleet. Japanese pilots would strafe landing craft, bomb transport ships, and turn the beaches into killing zones. Marines would die by the hundreds. Stout had seen what happened when Marines landed under air attack. At Tarawa, he had watched helplessly as Japanese planes devastated the first waves of landing craft. His decision took less than 30 seconds. He pushed the throttle forward and rolled the Hellcat into a dive. The altimeter unwound as he dropped toward the jungle canopy. His plan was simple: come in fast and low, hit the fuel drums first, and get out before the anti-aircraft gunners could track him. At 2,000 feet, he leveled off and pushed the throttle to the firewall. The Hellcat accelerated to nearly 400 mph, the engine screaming. Trees blurred beneath him as he dropped to barely 50 feet above the jungle. The airfield appeared through a gap in the trees. Japanese ground crews looked up in confusion as the Hellcat roared overhead. Some froze. Others dove for cover. None reached their anti-aircraft guns in time. Stout lined up on the northern row of aircraft and squeezed the trigger. All 6 machine guns opened fire, their combined roar drowning out the engine. Tracers stitched across the tarmac, tearing through a Zero's thin aluminum skin. Fuel sprayed from ruptured tanks. He adjusted slightly and fired into a cluster of fuel drums stacked between 2 bombers. The drums disintegrated under 50 caliber fire, and aviation fuel erupted in a massive fireball that engulfed both aircraft. The explosion was far larger than he expected, shaking his Hellcat as he pulled up. Behind him, the fire spread fast. The burning Zero ignited the next aircraft, then the next. Each explosion fed the next. Within seconds, half the northern row was engulfed in flames. Japanese ground crews ran in all directions. Anti-aircraft gunners finally reached their guns and opened fire. But Stout was already climbing away, weaving to spoil their aim. Tracers arced past his canopy. Explosive rounds punched through his tail section. Warning lights flickered, but the engine held. He circled back. Below, nearly 20 aircraft were burning, flames spreading across the tarmac like a river of fire. But the southern end of the field still held at least 20 more aircraft. He checked his ammo, half gone. 6 seconds of firing time left. Coming back meant almost certain death. He rolled inverted and dove again. This time the anti-aircraft fire was immediate and intense. The sky filled with tracers. Stout jinked left, then right, never flying straight long enough for the gunners to lead him. He came in from a different angle, targeting the bombers. His remaining ammunition shredded control surfaces and punctured fuel tanks. He walked his fire into a fuel truck, which exploded hard enough to flip a bomber onto its back. Secondary explosions began instantly. Burning fuel spread to stacked ammunition crates, which detonated in rapid blasts. The bomber's own ordnance cooked off, tearing the planes apart. Within moments, the entire southern row was burning as fiercely as the northern. Stout's guns fell silent, empty. The Hellcat felt sluggish, damaged control surfaces fighting him. More warning lights. A thin trail of smoke followed behind him, but below, the entire airfield was an inferno, every aircraft. Every fuel drum, every structure, a column of black smoke rose thousands of feet, marking the destruction. Stout turned the wounded Hellcat toward the ocean and headed back to USS Hornet. Hydraulics were failing. Oil pressure was dropping. He wasn't sure the landing gear would extend, but the engine still ran, and behind him, the Japanese strike force meant for the Marines of Peleliu was burning to ash. The flight back felt longer than the attack. Adrenaline faded, replaced by the realization of what he'd just done. He directly disobeyed orders. Instead of taking photographs and returning like he was told, he'd single-handedly attacked an entire airfield. Court-martial was a real possibility. So was getting chewed out by every officer between him and the admiral. But the alternative, watching those 40 aircraft massacre the Marines, would have been worse than any punishment the Navy could hand down. The Hornet appeared on the horizon. Stout radioed the tower and reported his situation. Aircraft damaged, uncertain about landing gear, requesting priority landing. The carrier turned into the wind and cleared the deck. His landing gear extended, but only partially. One wheel wouldn't lock. He came in hot and caught the second wire, the damaged Hellcat slamming onto the deck hard enough to buckle metal. Deck crews swarmed the aircraft immediately, shocked at the damage. The tail section was shredded. The fuselage had over a dozen holes. The paint was scorched black from flying through explosions. Stout climbed down from the cockpit and found himself facing a crowd of officers. The air boss wanted to know why he'd returned with combat damage from a reconnaissance mission. The squadron commander wanted to know why he'd broken radio silence. The intelligence officer wanted to know what the hell had happened over Peleliu. Stout's report was simple. The airfield wasn't abandoned. It was packed with aircraft, preparing to attack the invasion fleet. He'd destroyed them. All of them. 40 aircraft gone. 8 minutes, start to finish. The officers stared at him. The intelligence officer asked him to repeat the number. 40 aircraft destroyed by one pilot in a single aircraft. That seemed impossible. Reconnaissance photos confirmed it. The next day, the northern airfield at Peleliu was completely destroyed. Not a single aircraft remained operational. Aerial photos showed the burned-out hulks of exactly 40 Japanese planes scattered across a blackened tarmac. Fuel dumps were craters. Structures were rubble. Intelligence officers revised their assessment of Japanese air strength on Peleliu. Instead of facing 40 aircraft on D-Day, the Marines would hit the beaches with complete air superiority. The Japanese air threat had been eliminated by one pilot who'd refused to follow orders. The Navy awarded Stout the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for combat valor. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and aggressive fighting spirit in attacking superior enemy forces alone. His decision to engage had directly saved American lives. But the Battle of Peleliu that followed was brutal regardless. The Marines landed on September 15th, 1944, and immediately faced some of the most intense fighting in the Pacific. Japanese forces had fortified the island's coral ridges and caves, turning every position into a deadly stronghold. The battle lasted over 2 months and cost nearly 2,000 American lives. Yet without Stout's attack, the casualties would have been far worse. Those 40 Japanese aircraft would have attacked during the vulnerable first hours of the invasion, when Marines were packed in landing craft and transport ships. Air attacks on amphibious assaults were devastating, because the troops couldn't take cover or maneuver. Military historians later calculated that Stout's solo attack probably saved between 500 and 1,000 Marine lives in the first day alone. His 8 minutes of combat had accomplished what a full squadron of bombers might have achieved. And he'd done it at exactly the critical moment before the Japanese could disperse their aircraft. After the war, Stout returned to California and lived quietly. He rarely spoke about what he'd done over Peleliu. His children grew up knowing their father had served in the Pacific, but they didn't learn the details until decades later. The Navy Cross sat in a drawer, not displayed on any wall. Friends who knew him described a man who was uncomfortable with attention or praise. When asked about the attack, he'd downplay it. "I saw planes that needed destroying, so I destroyed them," he'd say. Any pilot would have done the same, but not every pilot would have. Most would have followed orders, radioed back, and let command handle it through proper channels. That bureaucratic approach would have given the Japanese time to scatter their aircraft or launch them. Stout's willingness to disobey orders and trust his own judgment made the difference. His story remained largely unknown outside military aviation circles until historians rediscovered the mission reports decades later. When researchers cross-referenced his Navy Cross citation with Japanese records and aerial photos, they realized the full significance of what he'd accomplished. 1 man, 1 aircraft, 8 minutes, 40 enemy planes destroyed, potentially 1,000 lives saved. The attack demonstrated something that military strategists study to this day: the value of initiative at the tactical level. Stout couldn't have known for certain that his decision was correct. He was guessing about the Japanese plans, gambling that his assessment of the threat was accurate, and betting his life on his ability to execute the attack. Everything about the situation argued for caution. Follow orders, report back, let someone higher up decide. But Stout understood that sometimes the person on the ground seeing the situation with their own eyes has better judgment than commanders looking at maps miles away. His willingness to trust his own assessment, even when it meant directly disobeying orders, embodied the principle of commander's intent. The Navy hadn't ordered him to attack that airfield, but they had sent him to protect the invasion force. He understood the intent behind his mission and adapted when circumstances demanded it. The Navy recognized this in awarding him the Navy Cross, rather than court-martialing him. They understood that rigid adherence to orders would have resulted in disaster. Stout's disobedience was actually the highest form of following intent over instruction. Modern fighter pilots study Stout's attack in tactical training courses, not just for the flying skills it demonstrated, but for the decision-making under pressure. The military teaches that sometimes following orders to the letter means missing opportunities that won't come again. The attack also demonstrated perfect target prioritization. Stout didn't waste ammunition trying to destroy 40 aircraft individually. He identified the fuel drums as the critical vulnerability and exploited it. 1 bullet in the right place accomplished more than 1,000 bullets in the wrong places. His approach from multiple angles, coming in low and fast to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire, showed tactical sophistication beyond simply pointing and shooting. He'd analyzed the defenses, planned his attack runs, and executed them despite taking damage. And critically, he'd known when to stop. After expending his ammunition, he didn't loiter, trying to assess damage or looking for additional targets. He got out. The mission was accomplished. Staying longer would have been pointless risk. All of these decisions happened in seconds under fire, with no time for careful deliberation. Stout's training and experience let him make split-second choices that each proved correct. Robert Cowboy. Stout died in 2005 at the age of 89. His family finally shared his story publicly, and military historians rushed to preserve the details before they were lost. The mission reports, reconnaissance photos, and Navy Cross citation all confirmed what seemed almost too dramatic to believe. In the final analysis, Stout's attack over Peleliu stands as one of the most successful solo strikes in naval aviation history. No other single pilot destroyed as many enemy aircraft in one mission during World War II. His 8 minutes of combat prevented what would have been a devastating air attack on the Peleliu invasion. The Marines who landed on those beaches never knew that a Navy pilot had disobeyed orders to save their lives. They fought through hell on that coral island, facing Japanese defenders in fortified positions. Positions that turned every yard of ground into a battle. But at least the Marines didn't face 40 aircraft strafing them as they tried to reach shore. Sometimes the most heroic thing a soldier can do is refuse to follow orders, not out of cowardice or rebellion, but because the situation demands action that rigid adherence to procedure would prevent. Stout understood this instinctively. When confronted with a choice between doing what he was told and doing what needed to be done, he chose the mission over the orders. His legacy lives on in every tactical training course that teaches initiative over obedience, adaptation over rigidity, and trust in the judgment of the people on the ground. The military learned from Stout, and pilots like him, that sometimes the best course of action is the one nobody ordered you to take. The next time you face a situation where following the rules feels wrong, where rigid procedure conflicts with obvious necessity, remember Cowboy Stout circling over that airfield. He knew what needed to happen. He knew there would be consequences if he was wrong. And he did it anyway, because the alternative was worse.